stop slipping, and stop cutting your socks. We have 15 different color options between 3 grip socks and 2 sleeve types. Something for everybody at a price that just makes sense. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
$320 for a pair of football boots that you've never heard of before. Is there any chance that they could possibly be worth it? Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the Diadora Maximus Veloce ITA SLX, a football boot that might look familiar to regular viewers of this channel, and that's because they do share a lot of visual similarities to that of the Maximus Elite that I reviewed not too long ago. However, unlike the Elites that have a much more padded leather upper and that traditional fold-over flap tongue, the Veloce puts more of an emphasis on modern speed boot characteristics in that almost every element of this boot has been thinned out quite significantly, and as a whole, they have an entirely different fit and feel on feet, focusing much more on lockdown and responsiveness than what you'd find from the more traditional variant of the Maximus. However, for that emphasis on speed, you do pay quite the premium, where the normal Elite variation retails for an already quite high $280, the Veloce model does bear a $40 premium, bringing the retail price all the way up to $320, where granted the boots are made in Italy and the overall build quality I would say is quite good, but at that price point you can effectively buy any other football boot on the market, which of course calls into question, is there any reason at all why anybody should be considering these? Where as always, I'm going to be brutally honest and straight up with you guys. At anywhere near $300, I don't think the Maximus Veloce is worth your time or money. But because these have not been the most popular since dropping not that long ago, they are of course already discounted, where you can get them for $200, even a little bit under that. And at that price point, they now compete more closely from a quality and definitely feature standpoint to a bunch of other leather football boots that are readily available for either a little bit less or a little bit more. So compared to the competition at the $200 price point, are these actually good or one to avoid entirely? We're going to discuss all of that in today's review as we go over all the details of the Maximus Veloce, because there are some things that I really like and some things that I also think are pretty questionable. So if you're interested in learning more, including how they fit and feel on feet, please stick around. And if you are interested in a pair of these for yourself, you can pick them up well below their normal $320 retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes by checking out that first link down below. And as always, if you enjoy the unsugar-coated reviews and opinions on this channel, don't forget to drop a like on the video and make sure you're subscribed if you haven't already so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots as we head into 2025. So first things first, I'm going to share an opinion that I'm not sure that everybody will agree with, but I happen to think the Maximus Veloce is a very cool looking pair of football boots. I thought that about the Elite model with its more padded upper and fold over flap tongue, but I think more stripped down and thinned out, especially in red, and maybe I'm just a sucker for red boots, I actually think these look really, really cool. Of course, this has nothing to do with performance, but if you're spending a lot of money on football boots, I think they need to look good, and I do think that these will stand out in the best ways possible. Having said that, when it comes to the Elite versus the Veloce, despite both being part of the Maximus family, you can very clearly see how big of a difference there is to the upper of these two boots. They're both made from what is listed as a full grain leather upper, so I can assume it's some kind of a calf leather, where on the Elite, it's super soft. It's really plush. I know people are going to get on Diadora like they do other brands for not utilizing kangaroo leather, but this is pretty much as soft a leather upper as you're going to find in the industry, but it should be soft considering the $280 price tag. You also, of course, get that fold over tongue held down by the elastic strap, and the actual tongue itself is made from that same soft padded leather. This, compared to most football boots that you can buy right now, just has a super heavily cushioned feel, which is great if that's your thing, but if you prefer something a little bit thinner, or if that's just what you're used to, because that's how most modern football boots are these days, I think the vast majority of people wouldn't necessarily love the feel that these have on offer, which is why they made the Maximus Veloce, which in comparison to just about any other leather speed boot on the market right now, this is still more padded and generally just thicker than something along the lines of, say, a Mizuno Morelia Neo 4 as an example. Of course, it's still not kangaroo leather, and at a $320 retail price, I think that's something that's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, but the leather as a whole is really high quality, and Diadora, especially their made in Italy products, at least from what I've tried over the last couple of years, the quality of the leather that they're using, kangaroo leather or not, I do think is still very, very good. Something I can also really appreciate from Diadora is the amount of leather we're actually getting here, where again, if you want to compare this to something along the lines of a Morelia Neo or even a Copa Icon 2 as an example, the leather cuts off on those boots at the forefoot, and then basically you just have it in the forefoot and toe area. On the Maximus Veloce, just like the Maximus Elite, that leather does flow into the midfoot pretty deep on both the lateral and medial side. So you get a very consistent soft leather touch pretty much all the way through, which I'm personally a really big fan of. The other additive to the leather that they've given here is while the majority of the upper does have that kind of smooth leather grain finish that doesn't provide much in the way of grip, they have added this grip texturing in the form of this gloss finish here on the medial side that does look like it would be quite grippy, but on the ball, I found it to be hardly noticeable. So for the most part, from a grip perspective, these are going to be on par with other more traditional plain leather football boots. Where they end up differing quite significantly though is when you get to the area across the top of the foot, where you can very clearly see that they've cut away that top area completely and stitched in this kind of textile-based synthetic material that ultimately ends up feeling like a relatively rigid plasticky synthetic that makes up the area that connects the laces to the upper. You do maintain a traditional U-throat construction with standalone tongue. However, that tongue is also made from that relatively firm kind of plasticky textile-based synthetic that makes the top of the foot significantly stiffer than the leather everywhere else. Now, whether or not you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, I suppose is really down to personal preference, but for me, I'd make the argument that it doesn't make a lot of sense to have this padded leather all the way through the entire area of the foot except the laces, because when you strike the ball here or make contact anywhere here, you'll definitely find that it's significantly thinner and kind of on the plasticky side in a way that doesn't necessarily feel good. Obviously, when you get into thin synthetics, they're always going to have a little bit of that plasticky sensation, but this really has that kind of hard, almost crunchy feel like synthetic football boots used to feel like going back 15, 20 years. So I would say by modern day standards, the material they've used here just isn't up to par with other synthetics on the market. I personally think it should be a lot softer. However, what I will say is that because of how stiff and rigid this material is, it does in turn make this boot feel significantly more secure, locked in, and responsive when compared to the much more traditionally constructed and more padded leather feel that you get from the Maximus Elite. But at the same time, let's be real, if you're considering the Maximus Elite, you're probably not considering these. They're more so just two different boots that happen to have the same name. To me, the eye-opening part of the construction of this upper is just how many different seams there are across the entire foot. You can see there is pretty heavy stitching where they connect the leather to the synthetic going all the way around, and you can definitely feel that little bit of bulk. You have the same harsher transition where it does transition from leather into synthetic as you get into the heel area, which isn't quite as noticeable, but something you'll also notice as a pretty significant change coming from the Maximus Elite is while it's still a low-cut design, almost all of the padding in the heel liner has been removed. And that's not an exaggeration. You go from something that is super padded and honestly very comfortable to something that really feels stiff and rigid in ways that I personally don't really care for. Where the heel liner itself is okay, it's still that soft microfiber material that does a nice job of gripping your socks to help hold your heel in place. There's still an internal plastic heel counter, which is nice and solid, and there is some padding in the heel liner. It's just positioned a little bit higher up, which I don't necessarily have too many issues with. At the very base of that heel liner though, you are kind of sitting directly against the plastic, which isn't uncomfortable, but I don't think it stands out as being particularly comfortable either. Personally, I just think think more padding in the heel area would have done this boot a lot of good from an overall comfort perspective. But for me, the main issue that I had with this heel area is actually right where this liner along the top edge ends, because what you'll find is that all of these materials, the synthetic, the leather, and the synthetic, all join in this one spot, and it creates a very, very hard piece on the sides of the ankle, where I don't know if it's my ankles in particular, but I have this very small bone just at the base of my ankle that pushes directly into this spot right here, and it is so uncomfortable out of the box. It's a little bit surprising to me that Diadora released this to the public. Granted, your mileage may vary depending on the specific shape of your feet and ankles, but for me personally, I found break-in in these boots to be less than exceptional. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that it's bad, because I really don't see any good reason why they would want to make this kind of side of the ankle piece as hard as they've made it here. The insoles are of course fully removable and pretty straightforward. It features a mesh liner on top. It's made from a relatively thin, fairly cheap piece of white foam with yellow foam inserts in the heel as well as the forefoot. Where as far as insoles go, they're not dissimilar to what you're going to find on a lot of top-end football boots, but again, at $320, I personally would expect something at least a little bit more premium. These, I would say, fall on the cheaper side of what you're going to find from most football boot insoles. Moving to the base, you're going to find the same sole plate and stud pattern that you'll get on the Maximus Elite, being made from a bi-density Pebax material, Pebax being a specific type of plastic, where Diadora is claiming that some of the Pebax is stiffer, some of the Pebax is more flexible. They're trying to strike that nice balance between flexibility and overall responsiveness, which I actually think they've done quite well. The boot, despite its more traditional appearance from the bottom, does have a relatively firm sensation in the forefoot, but it also doesn't feel restrictive. I think it bends very naturally with your foot, and as a whole feels responsive without being too soft, if that makes any sense. It's definitely not an overly stiff sole plate like you'll find from some speed boots on the market, but as a whole, I think it strikes a nice balance. Also, I really do like the fact that you get the 3 rivets at the tip of the toe, connecting the sole plate to the upper. It again speaks to the made in Italy build quality of these Diadoras, and it's kind of a little bit of an old school element that we just don't see very often anymore. As for the stud pattern, this is what they call their Rotax 2.0 layout, where you can see it's all conical studs that make up a stud pattern that emphasizes rotational movements, but still also provides plenty of bite when pushing off. Because of the all-rounded shape, you kind of know what to expect from a feel and performance perspective. The one thing that I will say is that it does provide more aggressive traction than I think a lot of people might expect based on how it looks. Paired up with this sole plate, I actually really like this element of the football boot. It might not be as visually exciting as some other options on the market, but from a performance and feel standpoint, it's very solid. And then there's the weight, where with its very speed-focused name in Maximus Veloce, especially at $320, I think the expectation should be that these are pretty lightweight. So that's exactly what we're going to find out using a scale, and we're even going to compare them to what would now be a similarly priced option in the Copa Icon 2 from Adidas at $180, both in the same size 9.5 US. We'll start off with the Copa Icon 2s that weigh in at a very lightweight 7 ounces exactly, the equivalent of 199 grams. Change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the Diadoras, and you can see that they weigh in at 8.55 ounces, the equivalent of 242 grams. That's 43 grams more than the Icon 2, which is quite significant, and compared to every other top-end speed boot currently on the market, most of which cost significantly less than these at full retail price, they're just not up to par. Where, don't get me wrong, they're not super heavy, but if you're looking for that very lightweight feel that you'd expect to get from a pair of top-end speed boots, these might be a little disappointing. When it comes to the fit and feel on feet, this is where, unfortunately, the Maximus Veloce kind of falls apart, because as much as I like the feel of this sole plate and stud pattern, and as much as this calf leather upper is undeniably very soft and premium, because of other elements that this football boot has, the end result is a pair that just does not feel very good. In fact, in some ways, I'd say that they're uncomfortable. With the area across the top of the foot being one of my major complaints here, in that while this synthetic does make the boot feel surprisingly locked in and responsive with the laces tied tight, it adds a significant amount of structure to the upper. It unfortunately just doesn't feel very good. Not to the point where I think it's necessarily super uncomfortable, but it's a stiff, rigid, kind of plasticky synthetic material that digs into the top of your foot area where the tongue ends. There's a little bit of a lace bite because there really is no padding there, and it's just such a stark contrast from the soft leather. It almost feels like it's not supposed to be there, and it's not a good sensation overall. While it definitely would have changed the overall feel of the football boot quite significantly as it relates to making these feel more locked in and responsive, I definitely think if they made the laced area or even just the tongue out of the same soft leather as the rest of the upper, the boot would have felt 10 times more comfortable. And then there's the heel area where, like I mentioned earlier, there's that little spot that kind of digs into the base of my ankle where, again, it could just be my ankles, but given that this is not an issue that I have with any other football boot, I can only attribute this problem to this particular pair. It wasn't an issue with the more heavily padded Maximus Elite, so I can only assume that because they've stripped out all the padding, that's why I'm experiencing discomfort on the Maximus Veloce. And then at the back of the heel, like I showed you, all the padding has been removed, or at least the vast majority of it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can have a really thin heel lining material and still have great lockdown and overall comfort. Unfortunately, I wouldn't say that this is a top-notch execution overall. And for a pair of football boots that have a padded leather upper as premium as these ones do, my expectations when it comes to comfort are pretty high. And unfortunately, these have not come anywhere close to meeting those expectations, especially for $320. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that they are in the top 3 most uncomfortable top-end football boots that I've had on my feet over the last couple years. When it comes to fit and sizing, from a width perspective, these definitely seem to have a little bit of a slimmer profile compared to the Maximus Elite, where granted, I think the more padded leather upper of that boot is just softer and does have that little bit of extra stretch to it. Not that these won't stretch as well, given that they are such a soft leather, but certainly they have a more snug fit than I think a lot of people would expect, where if you have really, really wide feet, I don't necessarily think that these are going to be a great option just because that synthetic material across the top of the foot is going to restrict a lot of that stretch. But at the same time, I do think from a width perspective, they are going to be suitable for most people. And then as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So if you are looking to get a pair of Diadoras for yourself, I would personally recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. To make a long story short, unfortunately for me, they don't feel anywhere near as good as I think they look. So in conclusion, as much as I really love what Diadora tried to do with the Maximus Veloce, even under $200 on sale, it's a pretty tough pair of football boots for me to recommend. Where if you're familiar with the Diadora Maximus line, once upon a time, it was cutting edge in the world of football boots, where more often than not, a lot of the technology was kind of gimmicky. Spring-loaded studs is the one that really stands out to me as being one of the craziest things they've ever done with the Diadora Maximus, but they were still football boots that at the end of the day, more often than not, felt incredibly comfortable on feet. And that, unfortunately, is not something that I can say about the Maximus Veloce. And in 2025, especially if you're going to charge $320 for them, the comfort should be phenomenal, especially with a full soft leather upper that this has. But unfortunately, that is not the case. If you're really after a pair of leather speed boots, I think the Copa Icon 2 at $180 just blows these out of the water. Whereas if you just want a good pair of leather boots in general, quite literally anything leather from Mizuno or Adidas is better than these.